open it up for questions, whether that's verbal or you can also type things in the chat box and I can read those off to Eric as well. So thanks everybody for joining, and I'll hand it off to Eric.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jody, for the introduction. And I think everyone can see my slides and hear me. Awesome. Got to check that. So yeah, I want to thank you all for joining me today for my thesis defense seminar. My name is Eric Jensen. I'm a master's student in the graduate degree program in ecology at Colorado State University, advised in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability. And I wanted to start with a brief note about wildfire, because living in Colorado this summer, wildfire has been at the top of my mind, and I think, like a lot of us, that's been the case. Working on this project and others like it, I've been thinking a lot about how increasing wildfire activity will affect ecosystems in the future. And so in this talk, I would really like to invite you to consider the types of impacts that wildfire has on ecosystems even decades after fires occur. And with that, I will share with you my master's thesis topic, leveraging the Landsat archive to characterize plant species diversity and post-fire recovery in Great Basin shrublands. I wanted to first provide an outline for my presentation. I'll begin by providing some background on Great Basin shrubland ecosystems, especially as related to fire and post-fire vegetation recovery. Then I'll present my first chapter, Developing Models of Plant Species Diversity. In my second chapter, I'll dive into an analysis of environmental and management drivers of post-fire recovery. And finally, I'll draw out some big picture takeaways that have come out of this project. You may have also noticed the ticker at the bottom of my screen as well. Throughout the presentation, each slide will have those arrows to help you orient to where I am in the presentation. And without further ado, I'll give some background about the Great Basin. The Great Basin is a relatively high elevation, cold desert region that's comprised of portions of 5 states in the southwestern United States. It's the most mountainous region in the continental US, and because of that topographic variability, it is also very diverse, both climatologically and ecologically. Generally speaking, lower elevations are historically characterized as shrublands that are co-dominated by perennial grasses, which then grade into conifer woodlands and eventually forests, generally when increasing in elevation. For today's presentation, I'll be focusing on shrublands, which dominate much of the region. In particular, my presentation will apply satellite-derived remote sensing and other spatial data sets to examine the impacts of fire and post-fire vegetation recovery patterns. Native Great Basin plant systems are dominated by perennial plants with minor components of annual forbs and grasses. However, what's known as the cheatgrass fire cycle is a positive feedback cycle that degrades plant communities in the region. Noxious annual herbaceous plants, such as cheatgrass, though including others, green up with moisture and warmer temperatures in the spring. Then, as conditions dry, those plants set seed, dry out, and form a volatile fuel bed. That fuel bed can carry fire through shrubland systems, diminishing perennial plants, especially long-lived shrubs like sagebrush. In the absence of competition from perennial plants, annual grasses can further dominate those sites. So to sum up, cheatgrass leads to fire, which in turn leads to more cheatgrass and ultimately results in more frequent fires in cheatgrass-dominated sites. In the animation displayed on the right, you're seeing fire activity in the region over 34 years. During that period, some locations burned 5 or more times, whereas historically, sagebrush sites have burned every 60 to 100 years, according to some studies. As a result, Great Basin shrublands are poorly adapted to frequent fire, and once those communities are dominated by annual grasses, they support more frequent fire and are difficult to recover to their native community. Advanced vegetation models, like those displayed on the left from Brady Allred and his colleagues, can help to monitor vegetation change through time. In that map, you see annual herbaceous plants, which are primarily noxious, displayed in red, and perennial shrubs and herbaceous plants displayed in blue and green, respectively. Visualizing fire activity and vegetation side by side can help to provide further insights. Two things that you may notice are that first, in the latter period of the time series, annual herbaceous plants are more abundant than in the earlier portion of the time series. And second, that big fires often occur during years in which there was a proliferation of annual herbaceous plants. To help to illustrate this more and to slow down this animation, here I will show an example from 2003, which was both a low year for fire activity and also a low year of annual herbaceous cover. Conversely, in 2012, a record of over 2.5 million acres burned in the region during a high cheatgrass year. These patterns indicate the cycle of cheatgrass and fire on a regional scale. However, you may have also noticed that there is variability across the region in terms of how vegetation patterns have progressed through time at different locations. As three examples of this regional variability, I have displayed 3 photos of sites that I visited during the summer of 2019 in the West Central Great Basin. Each of these sites burned in the late 1990s or early 2000s and had post-fire seeding applied shortly afterward. None of those sites have burned in about the 20 years since then. The location in the top photo has had robust recovery with abundant native shrubs and perennial bunch grasses. The middle photo shows a landscape that has had some shrub and perennial grass recovery, but also shows a lot of cheatgrass in plant interspaces. Finally, the bottom photo is essentially a cheatgrass monoculture with few to no perennial or native plants. The variability of recovery has led to concepts of resilience and resistance becoming important in the region. For this project, resilience refers to the maintenance of ecological function following stress or disturbance, which in this case is focusing on fire. And resistance refers to resistance to opportunistic non-native species, which in this case refers to annual herbaceous plants. Theoretically, plant species diversity relates to resilience and resistance, which is why I'll be focusing on that in the first chapter of my thesis, with one paper in the region finding a negative correlation between species richness and cheatgrass cover. Resilience and resistance maps and indicators are valuable to Great Basin natural resource managers, especially in the post-fire environment. The Great Basin is comprised of roughly 70% public lands, or 114 million acres. This means that managers have to make decisions about post-fire management over large swaths of land, and these maps help managers to make those decisions. The most prominent map of resilience and resistance for the region uses soil moisture and temperature regimes as an indicator of resilience and resistance more generally, and is displayed on the right. While soil moisture and temperature are well established as primary drivers of resilience and resistance in the region, it is also recognized that a variety of other factors affect post-fire recovery, including climate, topography, soils, and disturbance. Given the variety of spatial data sets now available, it is increasingly possible to use data-driven approaches to evaluate and characterize ecological resilience and resistance across the Great Basin, and that's the focus of my talk today. With that, I'll jump into my first chapter, which will focus on modeling plant species diversity as a potential indicator of resilience and resistance more generally. And today I'll be focusing more on my second chapter than my first. And the reason for that is that my first chapter is primarily intended to support the analysis of post-fire recovery in chapter 2. So with that, there are 2 primary objectives that I'll be talking about in my first chapter. The first is to test whether satellite remote sensing data can be used to model plant species diversity. In particular, I will test the spectral heterogeneity hypothesis, which I will discuss shortly. Then in my second objective, I will test whether adding environmental variables like soils, climate, topography, and fire to the satellite remote sensing variables from objective 1 can be used to model plant species diversity. Nested within the second objective, I will also evaluate environmental variables of plant species diversity. So before I jump into discussing spectral heterogeneity, I wanted to first briefly define spectral data. In this case, spectral data refers to data collected by sensors that measure reflectance from the Earth's surface of different portions of the electromagnetic spectrum. As a result, the spectral heterogeneity hypothesis has been developed within the remote sensing literature over the past 20 years, and at its core is the idea that spectral heterogeneity relates to plant species diversity. Several studies even suggest that spectral heterogeneity indices can be used to monitor plant species diversity. In general, there are three approaches for calculating spectral heterogeneity. The first is to measure heterogeneity of pixel values across space. Theoretically, more diverse plant communities have more diverse pixel values within a given area. Commonly, these are applied to vegetation health indices like the normalized difference vegetation index. The second is heterogeneity in spectral space. Remote sensing images are comprised of multiple bands, measuring different segments of the electromagnetic spectrum. Measures of heterogeneity in spectral space account for values of all the bands for each pixel and their variability through space. The third is dispersion in spectral space. These indices directly measure distances between values of different bands in spectral space on a pixel by pixel basis. In my study, I focused primarily on only the first two classes of spectral heterogeneity because of complications related to computing in measuring dispersion. To produce models of plant diversity, I related satellite data, which I just discussed, and other spatial data sets, which I will soon discuss, to field-measured plant diversity data. During the past 2 decades, the Bureau of Land Management and the Natural Resources Conservation Service have developed and adopted complementary field sampling methodologies that are especially powerful in analyses like this. Those plots in the region can be seen in the animation on the right. For this study, I used over 11,000 field plots collected in the Great Basin and Snake River Plains since 2008, using species richness as collected in the species inventory protocol as my species diversity variable. In this case, species richness is the number of unique plants within a 30-meter radius plot as identified by field crews. I buffered each plot by 100 meters for calculating spectral heterogeneity measures. So without going into detail on the spectral heterogeneity variables that I evaluated, I calculated 78 total variables using Landsat satellites 5, 7, and 8. In general, using the classes of spectral heterogeneity that I described earlier, the variables in the top portion of the table can be considered measures of heterogeneity in space, and the variables in the bottom portion of the table can be considered measures of heterogeneity in spectral space. In general, the spectral heterogeneity variables were weakly predictive of species richness on their own and had much weaker relationships than demonstrated in previous studies. I also evaluated interactions of all spectral heterogeneity variables by combining them in models, which were only marginally more predictive. Overall, I found that spectral heterogeneity variables are not strong enough to predict plant species diversity at the broad scale of the Great Basin. And this is not surprising based on the literature. One study by one of the progenitors of the spectral heterogeneity hypothesis found that at broad regional scales, environmental variables are more predictive of species diversity than spectral heterogeneity, and that's certainly what I found. Another paper suggested that in the development of the spectral heterogeneity hypothesis, little attention was paid to spatial and temporal variation. There are also unique factors in the Great Basin, such as high levels of bare ground and variable plant phenology that are not common in the region where this hypothesis has been applied, that likely confound spectral relationships. With that, it was clear that to achieve the project goal of modeling plant species diversity, environmental variables would be needed as well. Ultimately, I produced a model of species richness that added environmental variables such as climate, topography, fires, and soils alongside the spectral variables described to this point. From here forward, I will refer to this model that combines all these variables as the environmental model of species richness because it accounts for environmental variables. Many of the environmental variables included in the model and listed in the table are known to be important drivers of vegetation in the region. In total, the model evaluated 220 variables. I produced the environmental model using the random forest algorithm. Briefly, random forest is a machine learning algorithm that uses a series of decision trees as a model and is particularly useful with large data sets. After training the random forest model, it can be applied to make predictions about a variable of interest. In my case, I used the random forest model to create maps of predictions of plant species richness. The final maps were created by applying the trained model to produce separate maps of species richness for each year between 1994 and 2017. The environmental model performed much better than the spectral heterogeneity variables did, achieving an R² of 0.52 at a mean absolute error of 5.03. Further, the plot of predicted species richness values plotted against field observations of species richness on the right shows the values closely clustering together and approaching the ideal one-to-one line, demonstrating strong model performance. Lending further confidence to the model was the fact that of the 21 variables selected for inclusion in the final model by the random forest algorithm, several are known drivers of plant communities in the Great Basin. These include measures of precipitation and aridity and topography. In particular, precipitation and aridity are known to be important to species richness and primary production in the region. Additionally, topographic slope has been documented as an important driver of plant biodiversity in other regions of the world. I next applied the environmental model of species richness to geographic data for the Great Basin to produce the annual maps of estimated species richness for each year between 1994 and 2017. For the sake of simplicity, I will only show a few maps here, first starting with a map of estimated species richness for the year 2017. The regional map in the top right depicts general patterns of the lowest species diversity in playas and highest diversity in northern portions of the region. In the bottom left panel of the map, we can see field collected data points of species richness, represented as squares, overlaid onto the model predictions. In general, the model captures patterns of species richness. Yellow field points, indicating higher species diversity, overlay onto more yellow portions of the map. Likewise, points symbolized as blue overlay onto more blue portions of the map. But we can also see that the values in the spatial data set do have higher variance than those depicted in those same areas, suggesting that model predictions are not completely capturing the extremes of the field collected species richness values, which is a common limitation in random forest models. Another outcome of mapping species richness through time is the ability to view change from the beginning of the analysis to the end. Right now, I will click through a few maps to show this application. The map that we are looking at now is an average of the first 3 years of the time series, 1994 through 1996. The next map is an average of the last 3 years of the time series, 2015 through 2017. Finally, this last map shows the difference between those two maps. Here, more negative values are depicted in purple and are modeled as having lost species richness, and more positive values are depicted in green and are modeled as having gained species richness. Generally speaking, northern portions are predicted to have lost species richness, whereas more southern portions tend to have gained it in this map. It should be noted that while these change maps can be very useful, further investigation is needed to validate whether predicted change aligns with actual changes in plant diversity, given some of the error known in the model. The final maps that I would like to share for my first chapter compare contemporary species richness on the left to contemporary annual herbaceous cover on the right. In general, the maps appear to show a negative relationship between the two variables. In particular, the portions of the Western Great Basin and Snake River Plain have relatively high annual herbaceous cover and low species richness. The converse appears to be true as well, with higher areas of species richness often corresponding with lower annual herbaceous cover. These findings support the findings of Shinneman and Baker from 2009, that cheatgrass and species richness are negatively correlated. But here we can extrapolate to the broad region of the Great Basin. However, the question of whether species richness is an important driver of post-fire resistance to annual invasion remains, which I will now explore in my second chapter. So as I transition to my second chapter, the remainder of my talk will focus on how post-fire vegetation recovery and ecological resilience and resistance in Great Basin shrublands, in part evaluating the role of species richness in recovery. And in this chapter, I'll focus on three primary objectives. The first will be to evaluate the impact of repeated burning on perennial plant communities. In particular, I'll focus on whether sites that burn multiple times are more at risk of not recovering their perennial plant components, and whether those risks vary in different locations across the region. My second objective will be to assess the effectiveness of aerial and drill seeding for post-fire perennial plant recovery. And will similarly evaluate whether seeding outcomes vary in different locations across the region. And third, I will directly model post-fire perennial plant recovery, and will evaluate which environmental and management drivers are most important for recovery. I will then apply that model to predict vegetation recovery for a contemporary fire. So one of the biggest challenges of tracking vegetation change across an entire region is relating remote sensing data to some sort of vegetation variable of interest. Data from the Landsat archive are ideal for analyzing vegetation change through time, because the directly comparable Landsat satellites have been collecting data nearly continuously since 1984. Additionally, in the past years, significant gains have been made in using Landsat data to model ecological variables directly. This year, Brady Allred and his colleagues published version 2 of the rangeland analysis platform. These models map fractional cover of plant functional groups like shrubs, annual herbaceous plants, and perennial herbaceous plants at an annual time step. Given the importance of the predominance of perennial plants to annual plants in the Great Basin in particular, this data set is ideal for tracking vegetation change through time across the region. And because of the importance of the relative dominance of perennial plants to annual plants, here I will be proposing what I'm calling the normalized difference perennial dominance index. From here forward, the NDPDI. Inspired by the normalized difference vegetation index, the NDPDI differences the perennial cover from the annual cover, as estimated by the rangeland analysis platform dataset described on the previous slide. The figure on the right shows generally how you can interpret values of NDPDI throughout this presentation. A value of 2 indicates a plant community that is entirely perennial plants. A value of 1 indicates an even split of perennials and annuals. And a value of 0 indicates a plant community that is entirely annual plants. To make this a bit more concrete, if we relate these values to the field locations that I described earlier, the top image would be very nearly a 2, the middle image would be about a 1, and the bottom image would be about a 0. There are several advantages of an index like this. First, it is easily interpretable. Second, it is unbiased for vegetation cover, as that can be quite variable across the region. And last, it is succinct as an indicator of rangeland vegetation condition, which makes it ideal for modeling applications such as this. And so I will be applying NDPDI throughout much of the presentation going forward. My post-fire recovery analysis focused on 7 fires. I used several criteria to select those fires in relation to the project objectives. They had to have burned between 1994 and 2003 to allow for pre-fire and post-fire analysis using Landsat satellite data. Second, a significant portion had to have not burned since the fire of interest. In the map on the right showing all of the fires, the gaps in project areas are areas where fires have burned subsequently and have been removed from the analysis. The fires had to have occurred primarily in shrubland systems. Fourth, there had to be significant post-fire seeding in each fire. And fifth, the fires had to be distributed across the Great Basin. In the map on the right, you can see maps of each fire displayed, overlaid with polygons of the number of times burned, including unburned areas adjacent to the fires, and areas that were seeded after the fire. I'll begin by investigating the impacts of repeated fire. For the 7 fires that my analysis focused on, locations burned between 1 and 4 times, with unburned pixels being analyzed as a control. To evaluate vegetation trends, I produced time series plots of NDPDI, which allow for visual evaluation of change through time. I also fit linear regression trends through post-fire NDPDI values to allow for quantitative evaluation of the 15-year post-fire perennial dominance. Each of these methods was first applied to all fires averaged together. Then I evaluated how recovery trends differed for each fire to account for some of the variability across the region. These 2 methods allow for evaluation of the cumulative effects of repeated fire. On this slide, I will show several plots like this for each of the number of times burned. And so I want to walk through the first one. This plot is the average over all unburned pixels and shows the NDPDI value itself in a squiggly black line and a linear regression trend line in the flat black line. On the x-axis is the year relative to the year of the most recent fire, with negative values being before the most recent fire and positive values after the fire. Of course, that is somewhat of a moot point here, as there was no fire in the unburned pixels. And in this case, that relates to the fire that was adjacent to these unburned pixels. The blue line depicts interannual variability through time, here showing variability increasing over time, generally. Finally, the y-axis is in terms of NDPDI. Interestingly, this plot of unburned locations indicates general declines in NDPDI over the course of the time series, suggesting baseline decline across the region, even in the absence of fire. Sites that burned once had similar pre-fire slopes to unburned areas, and then a sharp decline during the year of the fire, followed by a similar post-fire slope to unburned areas following the fire. Notice also that 15-year intercepts are significantly lower for areas that burned once relative to unburned locations. For burned twice, burned 3 times, and burned 4 times, we again see sharp declines during years in which there was fire. In this case, they're depicted as a red box because fires occurred throughout that period, depending on the polygons. But here, post-fire slopes are relatively flat overall. However, with the exception of burned 2 times plot areas, 15-year post-fire intercepts of NDPDI were progressively lower with each additional time burned. These findings suggest that successive fires cumulatively reduce perennial plant dominance. A similar but field-based study also evaluated cumulative effects of repeated burning to plant communities in the West Central Great Basin. They found that the first fire significantly diminished perennial plants and increased annual herbaceous plants, and that each additional fire had a similar but reduced impact. This seems to be supported by our results. Evaluating the effect of multiple fires across each fire individually tells a more nuanced story. For the Bilk Creek and Sombrero fires in the West Central Great Basin, the first fire significantly reduced 15-year post-fire NDPDI values, and then each successive fire further reduced it, suggesting a cumulative effect. However, not all vegetation communities had this response to repeated burning. The West Central and Big Juniper fires each maintained perennial dominance, even burning multiple times, and the West Basin fire experienced little to no decline in the 15-year post-fire NDPDI, even in locations that burned 3 times. It's well understood that post-fire recovery is variable in different locations, which underscores the importance of spatial perspectives of ecological resilience and resistance. Interestingly, these fires overlaid on a map of low, medium, and high resilience and resistance closely matches my results. Both the Bilk Creek and Sombrero fires that recovered poorly are mapped generally as having low resilience and resistance, whereas the Big Juniper and West Basin fires are depicted as having generally moderate and high resilience and resistance, respectively. My results suggest that vegetation responses to repeated fire vary significantly across the region. Interestingly, Mahood and Balch's study described earlier was conducted very near to the Bilk Creek and Sombrero fires. Our results support their conclusion for those fires, but point to more nuanced outcomes in other locations throughout the region. My results also seem to help validate current resilience and resistance maps and may be able to be used to help to draw out further nuance in those relationships. My analysis of the effect of post-fire seeding is very similar to the one I applied to the impacts of repeated fire. In this case, I analyzed locations that received aerial seeding, drill seeding, or no seeding. For this portion, I only analyzed sites that burned once to control for the influence of repeated fire. Here again, I produced time series plots of NDPDI for visual evaluation of trends through time and calculated post-fire linear regressions to extract 15-year post-fire intercepts, similar to the last objective. Also similarly, I applied these approaches first, averaged over all of the fires, and then applied them to each fire separately to evaluate whether there was variability in terms of the success of post-fire seeding in different fires. In general, I found that post-fire seeding had a negligible effect on post-fire NDPDI outcomes averaged across the region. In each case, the post-fire recovery slopes were negative, indicating continued decline even in the years following the fires. Additionally, the 15-year post-fire NDPDI values were actually highest for the unseeded areas and somewhat lower for aerial and drill seeded sites, suggesting that unseeded areas have, on average, better outcomes than those that received post-fire seeding. In this case, little more nuance can be derived by evaluating each fire individually. Evaluating outcomes of post-fire seeding on a fire-by-fire basis, the only fire that had better 15-year post-fire outcomes in seeded areas than unseeded areas was the Tawana Complex fire. There, both aerial and drill seeding were found to have better post-fire outcomes. For every other fire, however, seeded areas had worse post-fire outcomes than unseeded areas. In general, I found that post-fire seeding did not appreciably improve vegetation recovery. This result would not be surprising to land managers and restoration ecologists in the region. Post-fire seedings frequently fail, and at least 2 studies have found that environmental variables such as climate and topography are more influential to post-fire recovery than seeding. So the question remains whether it is possible that seeding actually leads to worse outcomes in terms of annual herbaceous plant dominance than seeding. Frankly, there probably isn't a straightforward answer, but I think the answer is most likely no. A likely explanation for the negative seeding outcomes in my results compared with the reality on the ground may be bias in the underlying data. There is known inaccuracy in the MTBS fire perimeters, and even within those perimeters, fires burn more severely in some areas and less severely in other areas. Meanwhile, land managers are likely to only apply seeding in areas that did in fact burn, and especially in areas that burned more severely. At the spatial extent of this analysis, it seems possible that this bias may be driving some of those negative outcomes that I'm seeing in the results. Nonetheless, our findings that seeding does not improve outcomes is supported by numerous other studies. So given the importance of environmental factors on post-fire recovery, the multivariate modeling approach that I will take in the next step can help to untangle the importance of these various recovery drivers. So my final objective of modeling post-fire recovery ties together the previous two objectives into a multivariate analysis. In this step, I modeled NDPDI 15 years following fire using random forest modeling, similarly to Chapter 1. I included similar environmental variables here as well to Chapter 1, but also added data on aerial and drill seeding and pre-fire vegetation, including pre-fire species richness that I developed in Chapter 1. Importantly, number of times burned is also a variable in the model. So as a result, this step really represents a culmination of the project, tying together other aspects of the project into a single analysis. Within this framework, I evaluate the importance of various environmental drivers. After training the random forest model, I applied the model to produce a map of predictions of 15-year post-fire NDPDI for the Saddle Draw Fire. The Saddle Draw Fire burned nearly 285,000 acres in southeastern Oregon in 2014. My model reported strong accuracy statistics with an R-squared value of 0.83 and the plot of model predictions against observed data clustering closely together very near the ideal 1-to-1 line. Additionally, to attempt to account for potential issues of spatial autocorrelation, I performed leave one out validation. Here I trained the model 7 times, each time leaving out one of the fires as a validation set. Then I applied the model to that fire that was left out and recorded the accuracy statistics. Overall, leave one out accuracy assessment averaged an R-squared of 0.34. These accuracy statistics likely better reflect the accuracy that we would expect when attempting to apply this model for a fire for which we do not have data, such as the Saddle Draw Fire, which I will discuss shortly. Overall, my modeling accuracy statistics match closely with a similar project from the Soda Fire in Idaho. My model of post-fire recovery had 17 variables selected based on their predictive importance, as depicted in the table. Pre-fire vegetation variables of perennial dominance and annual herbaceous cover were both highly important. Additionally, measures of precipitation and aridity, especially during the summer months, ranked highly and occupied several slots in the model. Here also, fire severity was important as well, with both fire severity metrics making it into the final model. Notably, the number of times burned, post-fire seeding, and species richness all did not rank highly enough to be included in this model. Other studies have found that pre-fire vegetation and post-fire precipitation are important, and that makes sense. Annual herbaceous plants do not depend on summer precipitation, as they've typically completed their life cycle by that time. Whereas perennial plants often depend on post-fire precipitation to drive recruitment of new plants. Additionally, it is well established that pre-fire herbaceous cover, perennial herbaceous cover in particular, helps to drive recovery after fire. So one of the most potentially powerful approaches of developing spatial models like this of post-fire recovery is to make predictions of recovery as fires occur. In this case, I applied the model to the Saddle Draw Fire, a large fire that burned in southeastern Oregon in 2014. The map on the right shows pre-fire NDPDI taken directly from the Rangeland Analysis Platform dataset, and I will walk us through a couple of other maps. The next map is the predicted 15-year post-fire NDPDI from the model, showing one potential recovery scenario. Finally, the last map shows the difference between the pre-fire map and the post-fire model predictions. Values in blue thus were modeled to have higher NDPDI after fire, and areas in brown were modeled to have lower NDPDI 15 years after fire. Theoretically, this type of approach can help to identify areas where post-fire vegetation recovery is more or less likely to occur. This knowledge could help land managers identify locations to perform post-fire management actions shortly after fires occur. However, while mapping predictions of post-fire recovery is certainly potentially powerful, this portion of my analysis should also be considered novel and preliminary. There are errors inherent in many of the input data sets, and those can be compounded in the modeling process. Additionally, this approach will need to be tested more. However, this step in the analysis is important because it presents an attempt at a data-driven approach to informing post-fire management. This type of approach is becoming increasingly possible now with advancements in computing and modeling, and can be increasingly useful to managers in the post-fire environment. Future modeling efforts should include more fires in the model training to capture more of the regional variability and to produce a stronger model overall. I'll close with some of the significant takeaways and next steps to this project. While species richness was not found to be highly predictive of post-fire recovery, maps of species richness likely have important conservation applications. A couple of examples could be informing locations to collect native seed for the BLM Seeds of Success program, or identifying areas for conservation that might support biodiversity, not just of plants, but also of pollinators, herbivores, and other higher level organisms. State and transition models are commonly used in the Great Basin to identify pathways that can drive ecosystems to alternative states. An example of this is the transition from a shrub-dominated state to an annual grass-dominated state that underpins some of the aspects of this presentation. With spatial state and transition models becoming more prominent, NDPDI could be a useful metric for tracking such state changes. A similar metric could also be developed for helping to identify transitions to conifer-dominated states. Current maps of resilience and resistance created from soil moisture and temperature data closely matched with my findings. With recent advancements in spatial datasets, modeling, and computing, it is now possible to more explicitly test existing maps of resilience and resistance and even develop new maps. While it was outside of the scope of this project presented today to propose a new methodology for mapping ecological resilience and resistance in the region, the methods presented here may be able to be extended to produce data-driven maps of resilience and resistance. And I wanted to close with a note on the future of Great Basin shrublands. The Great Basin has seen tremendous changes in recent decades. Given the driving role that precipitation and aridity play in recovery of perennial plant communities, most climate scenarios will only add more stress to that added by invasive plants and fire. It will be imperative that land managers are equipped with data, resources, and improved technology for restoration of this region. With any luck, this project will represent some small step forward in the restoration of the biome. And with that, I want to just make a flurry of thank yous. First to my advisor, Dr. Jody Vogler, and my lab mates, Steve, Jillian, and Patrick, who have all been provided incredible support and mentorship and assistance throughout this project. Beth Newingham at the USDA ARS provided a lot of background on Great Basin ecology, as well as support from her research technician and PhD students, Russell and Renee. Jason Seibold helped early with the development of this project and sits on the committee as well. The rangeland analysis platform team was very helpful with data and guidance, especially with my second chapter. I received a lot of data support throughout this project. Sarah Burnett and Sarah McCord from the Bureau of Land Management's AIM program were very helpful. Ken Spaeth as well with the NRCS's NRI data set. And Michelle Jeffries with the USGS helped with the land treatment digital library used for seeding polygons. Finally, I received incredible support from my friends and family. My wife and partner, Taryn, supported me throughout this project and pursuit of higher education, as well as helping me to figure out how to hopefully communicate this to somewhat diverse audiences of ecologists. Parents and family for putting up with not hearing back from me for a long time, friends all over the country who have been great to keep in touch with, and especially the NREL and ESS graduate student community. It's been just great to be able to get to know everyone and to be part of that community.
Great.
I have some literature cited for posterity, and with that, I'll close for questions.
If anybody wants to unmute themselves for a little applause, feel free, and then we'll go into some questions. But great job, Eric.
Nice job.
Woohoo! Good job, Eric.
That was a you always have very pretty presentations and very well organized. So thank you. And that was a great representation of your research. So with that, yeah, I want to, we have a few minutes here. If we want to take a few questions, you can either, I will open up my chat box if you want to do them in chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and we'll try to see if that works out as well.
And I'll stop sharing my screen so we can see everyone too.
Awesome.
Cool.
Give it a minute here if anybody has one.
Hey, Eric, I got a quick one.
Awesome. Go ahead.
Hey, man, by the way, that was a great presentation. Super interesting, super clear. Loved it. I had just a super brief question. I was thinking about, so the Tijuana complex showed improved seeding outcomes. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what my results suggested, yes.
I was just curious where it fell along that resistance resilience map that you showed for those two fires. Where does the Tijuana complex kind of fit in on that gradient?
So interestingly, that was the one fire that somewhat deviated from being able to validate that map. That fire was generally located in a low resilience and resistance area, and yet maintained perennial dominance and actually had improved outcomes from post-fire seeding. So while the other 6 fires kind of closely validated that data set, I think that was kind of one exception.
Sure, yeah. Cool, just curious. Thanks, man.
Yeah, thank you.
The committee is going to get plenty of chances to ask questions here in a few minutes, but if anybody else has any for them, or I'm sure you could also email them as well if you want to have separate conversations about this.
I haven't been watching the chat.
Oh, I've got you covered.
Oh, okay. Okay, cool.
Let's see. Is there, this is from Jillian, and so I might have missed this in presentation, but is there any information documenting variability between seeding treatments?
I'm Jillian, you can kind of clarify that if I'm misinterpreting, but I'm guessing in terms of outcomes of seeding treatments. I think generally they're very different types of approaches. So, you know, without being an expert on the different seeding treatments, I think generally speaking, drill seeding has higher success rates with establishing perennial grasses, especially. However, there can be some complications from my understanding with that as well, as the drill seeding can disrupt the soil and have some other factors as well. So yeah, that's the best response I can give to that.
You're getting a lot of congratulations and excellent jobs. So that's Any other questions before we take a few minute break here between the public and private part? Oh wait, let me see. We got some new. So from let's see. The results from NDPDI is very interesting. Did you consider any other indices that included shrubs?
So yeah, I didn't cover that in the public presentation here, but in my actual thesis, I dive into some of those more fractional components. And so it should be noted, I think, along with this, that this NDPDI glosses over a lot of detail in terms of kind of shrub dominance versus perennial herbaceous dominance. And there is some variability from fire to fire in each of those cases. So I would have to direct you to my written thesis for some of those details. However, I will note that there is some variability in terms of those recovery trajectories across the different fires.
Let's see, I have another one here from Allison. Do you think that this sort of modeling could be applied to higher severity fire in mountain forest terrain, or do you think it's constrained to more lower severity fires in rangelands?
I think that, yeah, interesting question on a few levels. I think to kind of tease out something there, I think that these fires might be mapped as lower severity, but for those systems, they are relatively high severity or high impact, at least. I think that more thought would have to be given to those ecological systems. I was in the development of this really thinking about the Great Basin, where there's really, I think, this kind of unique coarse divide between annuals being primarily these noxious plants. Of course, there are native annuals as well, but by and large, those are the important ones. And perennials being primarily native plants, with some exceptions as well, of course. And so I think that you'd really have to think about the system in particular, but I would guess that you'd want to maybe use a framework like this, but really think about whether that was appropriate. Knowing a little bit about those systems, you might be able to use something like this to, look at relative dominance between tree cover and both kinds of herbaceous cover, kind of symbolizing this kind of mixed grasslands.
I also had a question about whether the recording will be available. Eric, do you want to just have it be, if people are interested, to go ahead and email you for that?
I think I was going to try to throw it up online. I've heard from a few other folks that that they couldn't attend and they were interested. So rather than sending around a few 100 megabyte file or whatever, I thought I'd just throw it up on YouTube or something.
Okay, so maybe stay tuned on that announcement.
Yeah, I can send that out, or you can email me separately if you'd like to have that link.
We have one more here, and then we might go to a little break. So early on, you mentioned this is from Russell. Early on, you mentioned issues with remote sensing data and dealing with bare ground and rock for spectral heterogeneity. Do you have any plans of utilizing higher resolution spectral imagery in order to try and train more focus on vegetation to account for this?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question to think about. One of the things that I was a little bit limited on here is that I have data going back 12 years, and so I really needed spectral data that covered all the way back to 2008, and especially to kind of the early 2010s. And so satellites like Sentinel for this application were less ideal, even though Sentinel has higher resolution, higher spatial resolution, and might be better at picking out some of these spectral heterogeneity relationships. My intuition is that that just those spectral relationships, at least in terms of spectral heterogeneity, that finding generally that environmental variables start to override spectral heterogeneity would hold. And so I wouldn't put a lot of eggs in the basket of that providing a lot of kind of increased insight.
Okay. Well, I want to once again thank everybody for joining in to listen to Eric's research here. And Eric, during our few-minute break here, you can read through all of the congrats and and awesome support that you're getting there. And so with that, I'm going to ask everyone not in the committee to go ahead and sign off. For committee members, we'll take just a little 5-minute break if you need to re-up on that coffee, and then we will convene for the private part of Eric's defense. So Eric, take a few minutes, and we will all reconvene in 5 minutes. For everyone else, thanks for joining, and yeah, stay tuned for the written versions of Eric's work.
Thanks, everyone.